So just to sort of set the stage for why we're here, and also hopefully to set a tone that we can come together as a community of both educators and human beings who are really charged with holding a space for our students, our colleagues, and also ourselves in times that are particularly challenging. Just as we're facing today, perhaps a government shutdown, ICE raids, all kinds of very challenging things are happening today in our country. And so the purpose of this talk is really, this panel is for us to come together as a community and to talk amongst ourselves about how we might be better able to support our students, but also how we manage in a campus community that is very challenging for all of us, probably. In different ways, but how we can come together and try to think about some strategies that might support our students, as well as strategies to try to support ourselves in very challenging times. So we know that here at Berkeley, we've had some pretty challenging times just last fall, in September, in which we had many speakers come to campus, and we had a series of events that for many people, particularly students I'll just talk about in my department in the School of Social Welfare, many students were deeply challenged by what they witnessed on the campus in terms of the police, the heavy police presence that occurred on the campus. And so that was one of the instances in which for me as a faculty member, as a human being, was really hard for me to try to think about how I could support my students better. What was the best way to maneuver them across the campus, about being on the campus, and what are the implications of these kinds of stressors, both emotionally and psychologically, as well as materially. And so what I mean by that is that many students in my department came forth and said, we don't feel safe coming here with this kind of a police presence because as students of color, we feel particularly targeted. As undocumented students, we feel particularly vulnerable. So it's not just a matter of our psychological well-being alone, although that in and of itself is extremely important, but that there are some material harms that have come as a result of the kind of political and social environment in which we are living these days. And the question for me, and I think for many, from my colleagues and for many other people on the campus is, what is our role? What is our responsibility? What can we do to try to mitigate some of the harms that may have come to our students as well as to ourselves? In the case of the School of Social Welfare, a group of very committed students got together and actually advocated for themselves to have the chief of the UCPD police come to have a town hall essentially with the chief of police to try to better understand what her strategy was for trying to keep people safe, quote unquote, and who were supposed to feel safe in that kind of environment, right? And what does safe actually mean? So we really are still grappling with what that is, right? And I think the students came away feeling that they were able to advocate for themselves in a toxic environment to try to mitigate some of the stressors that they felt. But in the end, the end goal was unclear. And so for me, one of the reasons I felt so fortunate to be asked to participate on this panel is because I'm really grappling with this myself, both as a human being, as a woman of color, trying to maneuver through this environment. And I'm hoping that today we can have an opportunity to try to help each other and support each other. And we're going to hear from some exceptional scholars here as they think about how their work, their scholarship, and their own experience in the world might have something to bring to bear on what we're all going through here as a community. So with that, what I'd like to do before we start, because we do have a lot of people, and typically we would do introductions, but we have quite a few people. So what I'm hoping we could do is just if you could turn to someone who's close to you and just perhaps take a few minutes to share what brought you here today and what are some of the challenges you may be facing either for yourself or for the students with whom you work. And to just take a few minutes to share and to introduce yourselves and to build a little bit of community here in this space, because that's something that we don't typically get a chance to do here. So it's a Friday afternoon, there's food, take a minute to meet each other. All right, so thank you for participating in that. I hope you met someone that you hadn't had an opportunity to meet before. And with that, I'm going to introduce my colleague, Professor Imani Nuru-Jeter in the School of Public Health, and she's going to talk to you about her amazing work and also her amazing experience.
Welcome, everybody, and thank you all for coming and being part of this, as Tina said, community, this kind of space for us to dialogue about this very important issue that we're all facing. So we as panelists were asked to respond to a few questions. One was kind of what kind of research do we do that's relevant to the topic? And then also, what are the things that we struggle with as faculty, as educators in these troubled times in terms of dealing with that and then balancing that with our role as educators? So in terms of my work, I'm in the School of Public Health with a joint appointment in Community Health Sciences and Epidemiology. I'm a social epidemiologist by profession, and all of my research is around racial health disparities and inequities. And I make that distinction intentionally because we often get into the habit of using jargon or terminology, and I think it's really important to pay attention to language and what language conveys. And so disparity, which is a term that we use a lot, simply means difference, right? Are we studying difference? And we've known for a long time about a lot of the differences between different social groups in terms of their health outcomes. And equity, on the other hand, suggests that those differences are due to some type of injustice, right? That those differences are unfair and unjust in some way. And so in addition to studying racial health disparities, I'm also very interested in trying to better understand the kind of social forces that determine the what I would call non-random distribution of risk in the population. Distributions that tend to disproportionately impact communities of color, low-income communities, et cetera. So if I had to sum up my work in one statement, I would say that all of my work really tries to answer the question of why do blacks live sicker and die sooner than others? It's a big question that will take me well longer than my career to answer. But it's a nice way to kind of frame the work that I do. And I don't just do work on African American communities, but other communities of color as well. But I do have some focused research looking at African American, working with African American communities to try to address this question. So I would say that my work kind of falls along maybe 4 different research lines. One is really thinking about the intersection of race, gender, and socioeconomic position and patterning differences in health and inequities in health. I think that at least in public health, and I don't know if this is similar or different depending on the departments or spaces that you interact in, but we can still, despite what we know, have a tendency to think of ourselves, of our world and our communities as monolithic. Right, that we use pan-ethnic terminology to describe racial groups, like we say blacks, we say Asians, we say Latinos, without acknowledging, et cetera, without acknowledging the tremendous diversity and heterogeneity that exists within each of those groups. But in addition to our race, right, we don't walk around with just a racial identity. When I walk around in the world, I walk around as an African American, also as a woman, and not just as a woman, but as an African American woman of a certain age bracket that lives in a certain neighborhood, that has a certain history and a certain background. And all of that determines what I would consider to be the vector of resources and risk factors that I'm exposed to on a given day, right? So this work is really trying to step away from pigeonholing people into one social identity and really recognizing the intersectional nature of our social experiences and the way that that integration impacts our social experiences and then ultimately our health outcomes. A second area is looking at the area of place and health. So how do the places that we live in, that we work in, that we go in and out of every day impact our work? So really thinking about environment as they can be very beneficial, but they can also be reservoirs of toxic stress, right, which is the topic of our session today. Another area, so in that vein, I do work in the area of income inequality, racial residential segregation, concentrated poverty, and those kinds of things, thinking about, for example, how our neighborhoods not only impact our health, but how our neighborhoods are planned. And why is it that certain neighborhoods have more advertisements for alcohol and tobacco and other drugs? Why is it that some neighborhoods have such poor access to healthy foods, right? These are city planning issues. It's actually not even, I mean, I think everything is public health. Because everything impacts health, right? Health and well-being, mental health, physical health, emotional health, and social well-being. But I say that to say that I really think about public health as an interdisciplinary discipline where we need to be interacting and talking not just to other public health people, but to city planners and to transportation people and to the Department of Education, along with Health and Human Services, et cetera. Another area is kind of the intersection of social and psychobiological stress, which I think is really relevant to what we're talking about today. And maybe once we get into the conversation, I'll go through it a little bit more. But I handed out, just so you all have something to take away, a little packet of slides that start to touch on this idea of stress. And I just want to make a few comments about that. When we think, especially in public health, but I would argue in general, when we think of stress, we just tend to think of something bad, right? But the word stress is actually not inherently good or bad, right? Stress just means change. That's really all stress means. And there is on, I think the third slide, you have a definition of stress, where stress is defined as a process. And this definition was developed by what I would consider to be two giants in the field of health psychology, Richard Lazarus, who used to be here at UC Berkeley, and Susan Folkman, who's still at UCSF. And they defined stress as a process in which environmental demands, right, and we're all exposed to various demands each and every day, tax or exceed the adaptive capacity of an organism, resulting in psychological and biological changes that may place a person at risk for disease. And, we don't have to call it disease. We can just say poor states of well-being. And so this idea of a process is one, I think that's really important. So going back to the idea of stress being somewhat benign and just about change, we all experience stress when we engage in a vigorous walk across campus, right? But that's a good kind of stress. It gets our heart rate going and releases endorphins and does a lot of things that are good for us. So that's eustress, which is really the good form of stress. And then there's the bad form of stress that many of us typically think about, DI stress, distress, right? And so the first slide in your packet is just a very simple visual depiction of this idea of the stress process, which is, again, it's about change. But when we think about toxic stress, this is a really nice way to think about it. It was typically coined the general adaptation syndrome, but we can commonly think of it as the fight or flight response. And it just visually depicts how when we are exposed to an environmental demand, our body has a natural way of adapting to those demands in our environment, right? And that change is characterized by the upregulation of a variety of hormones, stress hormones, and other chemicals in the body that allow us to adapt optimally in the face or in the presence of stressors, right? So this kind of upregulation is a very normal part of our kind of normal adaptation. But the idea is that once those stressors are removed, or once we become accustomed to the presence of those stressors, we kind of come back down to resting state and physiologic balance is restored, right? So we activate and we recover. Very normal. If you turn to the next diagram, that kind of activation and recovery is depicted in that top box. And what I want to mention is the four bottom boxes, which in the literature have been termed allostatic load. So the top box is termed allostasis, maintaining stability through change, right? Very benign. Allostatic load, however, has been defined as the wear and tear the body experiences from repetitive experiences of stress. So I would characterize a lot of my work as sitting in the left box at the bottom, the repeated hit box. Repeated hits, and that's what I call chronic stress. So I kind of give you that background to lead up to the topic of today of toxic stress, which is about change, but it's the kind of unrelenting, consistent, persistent change that requires us to adapt so regularly that it results in this kind of chronic upregulation, overproduction of stress hormones in our bodies that can become very toxic to us and create an environment that leaves us more susceptible to a variety of poor health outcomes, right? So you can see in that box that we are activating and we're recovering, but we're being hit so frequently, one after another with repeated stressors, that the end result is this kind of consistent kind of high level of stress hormones in our bodies. Right. So, when we think about our social experiences, the environments that we live, work, and play in, how often are we experiencing stress? There's a great book written by Robert Sapolsky called Why Zebras Don't Get Ulcers. And I love that book. And he gives this analogy of, how there might be, and I'm an awful storyteller, so I'm not going to say it the way that he does, but, you might have this zebra nicely enjoying the jungle or enjoying the green pastures. And then this lion comes along. And so the zebra is food for the lion. And so the zebra is like jetting and running, trying to get away from this lion. But then let's say that's done and the zebra got away, and then the zebra goes and lays down somewhere. What the zebra doesn't do is say, why did that lion do that to me? Like, that was so unfair. I don't understand why that happened. And why does this happen every single day? This doesn't make any sense. There are other zebras. There are actually other animals in the jungle. Why is a lion picking on me? Because I have black stripes? Right? So going back to the idea of stress as a process, it's not just about the demands, the stimuli that we're exposed to in the environment, but it's also about the degree to which we appraise those demands as threatening. And we are much more likely to appraise those demands as threatening the more we experience them. Part of that is because the more we experience those demands, it decreases our capacity to cope with or manage those stressors. In public health, actually, I don't think it's public health, it's in psychology. There's a model called the reserve capacity model. So what is our reserve capacity for handling and managing the stressors that we know are going to impact us on an everyday basis? So this idea of just chronic stress, right, chronically wearing down our ability to cope is a problem, and I think leads to that kind of toxic stress that we were talking about. So in terms of thinking about social and psychobiological stress, this third area of my research is really thinking about kind of how do our social experiences impact physiologic function, leading us again to be more susceptible to health outcomes. And then the last area, and these areas are not mutually exclusive, is really thinking about racism and racial discrimination as a social determinant of health. How do we measure it? And then how do we design scholarship that allows us to, in a very valid and reliable way, understand this kind of concept. And it actually is more, understand this experience in the way that it impacts our health in myriad ways, right? Which is also a lifelong pursuit. So I mean, in a nutshell, that's the kind of work that I do, and I can honestly say that I wake up every day and I love the opportunity to be in an academic environment that honors freedom of thought and freedom of speech and freedom of inquiry. Having said that, what are some of the things that I struggle with? So I teach a class on social epidemiology where we talk all about race and social class and gender and intersectionality and place and the life course and all of these things. And it's an elective course, right, which is nice, right, because students don't have to take it. It's already known when students come into the classroom they want to be there, which makes it easy. But even though it's a self-selected group that comes into the classroom, it's one thing to think about these concepts intellectually. It's quite another to experience every day on the campus where you're walking in and out of classrooms with people who do and don't look like you, who do and don't think like you, especially some of the experiences that we've had over the past several years, Black Lives Matter and free speech and DACA and all of these things that are emerging. How do we deal with that? How do I deal with that? So in terms of answering this question, what are the things I struggle with? How do I, as an educator, create a space that welcomes the opportunity to have those conversations, especially given the kinds of things I teach about, but that I'm thinking in the back of my mind, I still have a curriculum to teach, right? And I still have an imperative to make sure that the objectives for this course are met, which may not include DACA and it may not include free speech. Those are examples. But in terms of being I think, sensitive to those kinds of things and wanting to create that space, I have found it difficult to figure out how to challenge doing that in the classroom while at the same time meeting my course objectives. And so one of the ways that I have, I think, tried myself to do that is to create space outside of the classroom, because I have a really difficult time, as many of you may have had the same experience. So public health is, I don't want to say it's primarily a graduate program, but I teach graduate students. I don't teach undergrads. So in graduate school, it's really not about lecturing to people, right? I mean, you want to facilitate their learning, and that means that they have to be part of that process. That means that there's a lot of discussion and a lot of engagement in all of that. So with that said, it can be very easy for the conversation to go off, and then you're challenged with, okay, wait, it's kind of going off topic. I need to bring them back to this. But then you don't want to cut them off, because then if you cut them off, are they going to be afraid to speak back up? Are they going to shut down? And you don't want to do that either. So, I mean, I think that's a challenge for probably many of us in general. But then I think when we're dealing with some of these very sensitive topics that are really hitting home with a lot of people, it becomes even more challenging. So one of the things that I try to do is to create spaces outside of the classroom to interact with not only my students, but just students in general, and especially students of color, to kind of create that space to have community where I'm not Professor Nuru Jeter, I'm just Amani, and I'm a Black woman just like you are, or I live in Fruitvale just like you do, or all the different things that make us similar and break down the hierarchies. The downside of that I've experienced is that it's very easy to burn out. And for those of us who have had certain histories and certain experiences, I think it's very easy to feel a moral and ethical obligation to be there for our students, to be present, especially if you're a person that when you went through school, you didn't have that, right? And you want to do things differently. How do you become that for your students? But then you burn out, right? And so trying to also balance that with finding restorative space for yourself, which can be very difficult and very challenging. When I came to Berkeley, I grew up in D.C. and I went to school on the East Coast. And what I knew about California was Berkeley, the free speech movement. And then I came out here with certain expectations to find a very different reality when I got here on campus and also in my academic unit. And so even that is challenging, being who I am in a space with other people that hold different viewpoints, that are much more conservative than my own, and learning to be okay with that and having the courage to speak out even when I'm the lone voice in the room. And so, and then trying to figure out how to educate and empower our students to be able to do the same thing. So, I think I can actually stop there. These are just some of the challenges I think I experienced, not only as an educator, but as a person on the Berkeley campus. I don't really just see myself as an educator. I love to just walk across campus and experience the nature and to see people, but the tension is palpable. Right. And so I'm really appreciative of things like Eula Taylor in African American Studies started a once a semester kind of gathering of Black female faculty and staff where we can just kind of get together and talk. And it has been so wonderful to just have that space to actually see when I first came here, I was only the second African American on tenure track in the School of Public Health. So it was kind of lonely. So to be able to see, there are other people over here in this department and over here in that department, but to imagine life outside of University Hall when you're trying to get tenure you don't really spend a lot of time doing that. So, and then meeting scholars like Rudy and Tina and being able to just I had an experience with Rudy where I was struggling with a research concept, and I went to his office and just said, can we sit down and talk about it? And he said, yeah, sit on the couch or the chair or whatever, and then just started writing on the whiteboard, and it was the most amazing experience ever. And I walked away and said, that's why I'm here. And it's so nice to have those experiences, and the same with Tina and so many other colleagues here. So, the burnout is real, but I think it's hard, and I'm looking forward to all of your suggestions about kind of what do you do to find that restorative space for yourselves.
Thank you.
Hi, everyone. I'll just jump in. My name is Rudy Mendoza-Denton, and I'm a professor of psychology. I also do a lot of work around equity and inclusion on campus, and I'm also involved with the Greater Good Science Center here at the university. And some of the things I'm going to say are going to relate to work to work and research and advice that's on the Greater Good Science Center portal on the web. I have 3 articles that I've printed out for you. And I'm not quite sure how we're going to do that, but anyway. Let me begin by with a couple of unscripted remarks, which is just the remarkable way, I think, in which Amani's talk previews what some of the healthy behaviors that we as educators and as scholars and as people in a stressful, toxic environment can engage in. You'll notice that Amani, before she got to some of the things that I have difficulty with, said, "But I'm so grateful to be on a campus where I can do my work and where my work is respected." So there was an expression of gratitude there. Amani concluded with there's communities of folks, even though my department has a very different makeup than I imagined. There's another group of people that I can rely on, actively seeking professional and personal relationships. And then she also said, and I love to walk around the campus, to walk around the nature. There's a little bit of reflection and sort of distraction away from the stimuli. So let's keep those in mind, and I really want to emphasize those points that I think really lead to being able to cope. And as Amani was saying, not burning out. I think Tina's exercise to have us talk a little bit about our experiences is also really helps us. It just makes us feel not alone. I noticed, for example, that Professor Barilli was the third person and other people were talking, and you actively went out and sought other people to actually connect with, and I thought that was a really, really beautiful thing. You should know that I was trying to get in there and be like, "Hey, why don't you talk over there?" But so that's kind of what I do. But I did want to acknowledge that that's also something that we do, that instead of sitting out in, which can be, it can be so awkward to be like, "Oh, nobody's talking to me, what am I going to do?" You actually went out and did something about it. And that gives us a sense of control. So I want to summarize 3 things that I think are helpful for us as educators and as individuals, but really specifically within this context for successful coping in the face of stress. And these are A, distraction, B, planfulness, and C, relationships. So let's get into the first one, distraction. Okay, when we have I have a student who is really anxious about getting into a particular graduate program, and he knows from the literature that instead of checking every single minute the website, which we all do, right? He goes to movies. He hangs out with his roommate. He plays with his cat and sends me 40 cat pictures a night. So these are very, very adaptive behaviors. I want to take a minute to just sort of link that up to the constant, the media's job is to have eyeballs on their website. So, government shutdown, and today on CNN it was 11.0909080706. At some point you've got to limit that media consumption, right? A corollary to that is what researchers call discriminative facility, summarized in such a lovely way by Sinead O'Connor. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference, right? So there's some things that Sinead O'Connor, remember that? What was that album? Yeah, okay. Where she was
Bible, right?
I'll start singing if Laughter's really good too. But does that, and that's what discriminative facility refers to. There's nothing I can do about a government shutdown, okay? So I'm just not going to monitor that and let it be, and it will be there. It will be there tomorrow. Right. Another thing, and this is so lovely. I brought something that I wanted to show you. This is my new planner for the year. I've been trying to work with these electronic to-do apps, Todoist and Wunderlist, and it never works because it's because there's always something pinging at me. Whereas and I literally went back to my childhood days, and I have my green pen and my red pen, but it's kind of like it's a method of planning and distracting from all those things. So, and one thing that's really helpful, I don't know if I'll be able to keep it up, but I'm literally saying email from 12 to 1 here, right? And as opposed to constantly checking email. And so let's examine what behaviors we engage in that are constantly sort of like that reflexive need to feel like we are in control. But all that's happening is we are doing the anti-zebra thing. Right, which is essentially a process that leads us to rumination, right? And rumination often, particularly when there's not a lot that we can do, really just keeps that chronic level of stress up. What else can you do? Distraction, right? So as my student goes to movies, etc., what is it that you can do? You can find time to read a book, to walk around nature, to practice gratitude, to practice compassion. And it sounds all like lovey and flowers and everything, etc., but it's really helpful. So in this, I chose this journal because it's, what are some things that you are especially grateful for this past month? My colleague opens it up and says, ugh, like this is not a planner, right? But it's so important to be able to just take a little bit of time to express that gratitude. Notice how Amani did that. Okay, so that's distraction, rumination, et cetera, et cetera. Planning and procedures, right? So a major reason why we feel like out of control is because we're constantly reacting to emails, to stimuli, to the latest tweet, the things. And please understand that I recognize the complexities of the day-to-day lives that we and our students are going through, but these are coping mechanisms. So I know that for me, in terms of planning my class in the past couple of years, and in last semester in particular, it was very stressful because I didn't know what to do with, what was it called, Free Speech Week, right? And up to really almost the last minute, I was like, am I going to cancel the class? Am I going to take the class? My students are emailing me, what is it that I'm going to do? Until I decided, you know what? I'm going to cancel the class and I'm going to put it on YouTube. And it was like almost immediate. Once I decided what I was going to do, there was a real sense of relief. Okay, I have a plan moving forward. So I just want to encourage you to, think about how many classes can a student miss if they want to engage in a social in social action of any kind. What procedures and policies are you going to have and able to apply fairly? Think about how does your course relate to current events, and are there activities that you can do to honor the students' sense that this is of the importance of these things? Really have a little bit of flexibility, because it's so at the same time that you plan, it's so easy to things happen, and you've got to be able to let some things go. Kind of like, but I had that plan and I was going to talk about this today, and if I don't, then that's going to get into the way of the midterm, et cetera, et cetera. We've been trained to be masters of the unpredictable schedule, right? And really take that training to heart, and sometimes recognize that those plans that we make are also an effort of control that we engage in. Third point, relationships. I highlighted Professor Barile again because so I apologize for putting you on the spot. I'm sorry. but because you reached out, and Amani also mentioned how she reached out. Tina had us come together, and you hear the word over and over, community, right? I know for the past year that Abby Rincon was in charge of a group of interested professors who were really interested in making a difference on campus. And there was even though it was supported by a grant, there was just this lunch series that we had together, and that was so meaningful because it was a chance to just sort of say, hey, we share a reality here, and what is it that we can do, for example, for our DACA students, or what is it? So there's a sense in which the relationships really matter. And I have to tell you, it's not just the Facebook stuff. That doesn't count. There's something really true about reading somebody's facial expression, sharing a spontaneous laugh together, sharing dinner, going to a movie. Don't underestimate the power of social relationships and of your family, of your friends, of your kids, of your pets. So I forgot to hand these out. But so these are there's three different handouts which say variations of thank you so much. Thanks. There's variations of what I've said here, but I hope that these comments help, and I'm looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you. Yeah, of course.
I just want to jump in with As Rudy was talking about coping, it got me thinking about some experiences that I've had as a faculty member in my department. I want to share one example with you. But before I do that, can I get a show of hands of how many faculty are in the room? Okay. And how many students? Okay.
Staff, maybe.
And staff. I'm sorry. Thank you. And I'm sorry, I didn't initially say staff because this is mostly relevant for faculty and student engagement. But do you all remember Freddie Gray? Yeah. So life happens in spite of the fact that we have to go teach when we may really not feel like it because we are just burdened. We're just dealing with a lot of stuff, but we still have to show up, right? And I'm saying this to both faculty and students. And so I was dealing with a lot of stuff around all of that. But, and Freddie Gray hit me particularly hard. And so one of the ways I coped was that I wrapped my door in I Am Freddie Gray posters. And a senior white male colleague came to me and said one day and pointed at my door and said, I want to talk to you about this. And so I'm thinking, oh, God, okay. So he comes into my office without being invited and sits down in my chair across from my desk and says, so the question that I have is, why did he run? So then I have to go to class. So I say this because, we're talking about how do we teach in troubled times, right? Things are affecting all of us all the time. How do I show up in class and teach my students effectively when I'm dealing with that? And that's just one example of many examples I could give you of my experience as a Black woman in my academic unit, right? And I'm not saying this to minimize all the wonderful things about my academic unit, but it's a reality. So as faculty, it can be challenging, I think, even in spite of all of these restorative things we try to do to figure out how to cope and still be effective at what we do as educators. How do we show up and maintain our integrity as educators when we're dealing with all that stuff? And then what I want to say to students is that sometimes you may actually not realize all the things that we're dealing with as faculty because we're not just teachers. We're people, right? And I'm not saying that you necessarily don't realize that, but it was just something that came to mind when Rudy was talking, and it's just really tricky to try to figure out how to deal with that, deal with your own emotions, and still show up for other people when you haven't even really shown up for yourself yet. So, I mean, I just wanted to give that one example. I'm sure we could probably turn on a tape recorder and have like some awesome data collection happen right now. But I'll.
No, thank you. Thank you so much for that. So certainly I could regale you all with similar experiences, but I won't, I guess. I just had just a few follow-up questions for the panel, and thank you so much for those really informative and practical ways of trying to handle our own stress, and as well as to think about the ways in which this accumulates for us, because I think that's really one of the main points that I heard from both of you, is that this is not just these stressors are not just individual incidents, but they really accumulate in our bodies over time. And that's one of the reasons I think we have to be incredibly mindful and think about them. So I have a couple of questions for you, and then would love to open it up to the rest of the community to either provide comments or ask questions or just have a dialogue. So one of the things, so I'm a social work scholar, and we think typically in terms of multi-level intervention, so both individual, community, and macro ways of thinking about how do we deal with the problems that we see in society. And so I want to sort of put this to the group, and also to the panel, to think about how do the sort of the individual level interventions that were characterized here, how do we perhaps think about how those might be scaled in a way that affects a community or a larger group? So we heard a lot about how this affects us as individuals, but how do we think about this, or how do you all think about this as a group? Because I know one of the things that just a little disclosure, maybe I shouldn't, but I will. When I see all the stuff that's going on in the news, my first reaction is I am on the phone, call my senator, you better do this, you better do that. So I am engaged in a democratic process to the extent possible, right? And so even though I do certainly disengage when I feel that it's causing a certain amount of stress for me, but I feel a certain responsibility as a social worker to engage in a larger level as well. And so I'm just wondering if people here or the panelists have any thoughts about how we might use some of these individual level strategies and how they may scale to a larger group.
We're like,
Okay. No, what you mentioned, Tina, is I'm not sure necessarily that I would make with that example such a strong distinction between individual level versus group level coping, because it is sort of an individual behavior focused on a group level outcome. In some senses, that's what and I'm looking at Abby Rincon here in the sense that it's an individual level, but it's a group level, it's a relationship level outcome. So being involved in your community and something that you value is both, mm-hmm. Right? I love, for example, to kind of just be outside and let people pet my dog, right? And it's and it feels great for me to be able to do that. And it's just this, I go to parent community meetings for my kids' school, et cetera, et cetera. So that's one way in which I don't see that like a necessarily a strong distinction, but there's also people that I feel that I do quite a bit with, like, within my campus, and so I try to also say I don't have to do and address every single social ill.
Yeah, we can't, right?
And I guess one example I would give is going back to this idea of community. So I gave the example of what Eula Taylor in African American Studies does. One of the other faculty members in the School of Public Health, Professor Mahasa Mujahid, also last semester started bringing together groups of students of color along with faculty of color to have an end of the semester just get together, right? So and I don't know if it came from this, but she is part of the resident faculty program. And so part of what she does is really cultivate interactions with students outside of the classroom, right? Because that's also part of being part of a social community. We're not just here to only learn, but to actually have a social experience. And so by doing that, she's bringing people together as community. And I think one of the reasons why that's so important is to recognize that you are not alone, that you're not going through this on your own. And when you do need to reach out, when you need someone to help you problem solve, that you have a community to reach out to help you in that effort. And we've mentioned Abby a few times before Abby left the School of Public Health. She can attest to kind of how we would come together as faculty and staff of color to support students. And, you know, we kind of had a really nice plan we strategized about, and this is kind of what you were talking about, multi-level, right? So structurally, how do we deal with some of the inequities that we know are happening? Mm-hmm. This is being recorded, right? So I need to be careful what I say.
Can I, if I can just add something, you know, with my comments, Tina, about, you know, that there's an individual and group level. I think I may not have addressed your concern about, you know, something that like activities or coping mechanisms that are kind of squarely placed within the at the level of a broader group or a community or an institution. I'm just wondering if maybe we can explore that a little bit. I'd love to learn.
It just struck me because I think we all need to sort of survive, frankly, right? And so the strategies that you mentioned are really important for us. Were really impactful for me to try to think about or to categorize them in such a manner that I could think, okay, I could do this on a day like today. I was quite stressed when I walked in here, and I did need some distraction, and Amy helped me reframe a couple of things, and it really did help me. But just to think about the ways in which we can think about ourselves, but also how that sort of aggregates up into a bigger collective, right? And so to hold that space to think about individual and collective action at the same time, that they're not exclusive. That's all. I was just curious about how we might think about that as a group.
Sometimes it's okay to not feel adequately equipped. So one is if the material doesn't necessarily make a direct connection. The other is, do you even feel, I hear a lot in the School of Public Health, I don't even feel like I would know the first thing about how to start to address this conversation in the classroom. But you don't always have to be the one to do it, right? We actually have a division of equity and inclusion, and in the School of Public Health, through a lot of student activism under the leadership of Abby Rincon, we had a series of town hall meetings on racism, power, and privilege. But Amy and Jenny came from E&I to facilitate those conversations. And it was wonderful. We provided the space, but we were able to invite people who had expertise and did know how to have those conversations. And so, I mean, I think that's one thing, is for us to really reflect on what resources do we have on campus and to really make use of those resources.
One of the things that I hear, and you hear this often, is I don't know what to do, right? And that implies a certain sense of loneliness and confusion of things. So I don't know that it's necessary to seek out experts, right? Because we're all kind of figuring it out as we go. So I in the same way that we say talk to Amy, but talk to each other, right? So that if and again, it brings us back to this idea of community and relationships. There's a lot to be done in being able to organize a group of people, and these things should be optional, I should say, and that's something that's in the handouts. But organizing groups, organizing interest groups, community groups, to simply everybody say, hey, we're all confused, and then have a plan moving forward. And there are many resources here as well, but it bringing people together makes a big difference.
And just to piggyback off that too, I think one of the experiences I had when I first came here was that it is really scary to really sort of step into the void, because none of us really know, as Rudy was saying, how to deal with this with any particular expertise. But one thing I found, I came here in 2014 and taught my first class just as Ferguson was going up in flames, and the uprisings were there, and then on the heels of all of these other things. And one of the things the students were very clear with us about as a faculty was that it's not necessarily that they want faculty to say the right thing, but they really oftentimes, at least from what students communicated to me, is that they want us to not pretend like it's not happening. To just acknowledge it, step into the void, step off the ledge, be scared with your students, be vulnerable, be a human being. You know, I mean, my grandmother was from a very small shtetl in Eastern Europe, and she would always say to me, "For God's sake, be a person." And that's sort of how I think about this.
I just wanted to, my name is Elida, I'm new to UC Berkeley, in the School of Business, Director of Inclusion and Diversity. And I wanted to just add to what Tina was saying. I think that when we take into consideration, I'm a clinical psychologist by training, I should say, and when we take into consideration that, like, with microaggressions or with trauma, like, learning in the classroom is really challenging because we're because we're distracted, right? And so acknowledging it up front goes a long way, you know. And I think about when there's been kind of more national tragedies like 9/11, I think nobody would have hesitated to acknowledge it and to say something and to create space for that. But, you know, Philando Castile, suddenly it feels like this is a niche thing, and maybe I don't know how to deal with that. And, you know, can we make that everybody's business for one? Right? If we're really trying to create a climate of equity, then, like, every human in this country should be important to all of us. And, you know, but without at least acknowledging it up front, then you're risking that you've lost some students through that whole class. Because they're wondering, is this going to come up? Is my teacher going to acknowledge it? Are we going to have space to talk about this? And so I think we, as you know, whether you're staff or faculty, I think we're all having contact with students.
Yeah.
In a mentoring or educating way. Then we have a role to kind of figure out how do we make space, even if it's just to say, you know, I'm having a hard time myself, and so I'm going to model this for my students and say, I'm having a hard time because I'm still processing what happened and it's impacting me on a personal level, but I'm going to try to stay present and do my job today, right? But at least acknowledging it. And of course you're risking being, you know, evaluated down or whatever, or being unprofessional, but that's like our reality as people of color showing up to this institution.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Me?
Yes.
Hi, I'm Savala, and I'm at the law school, and I would love to hear the panelists talk a little bit about how you, if your goal is to be responsive, proactively responsive in your classroom when things are going on, how do you manage the reality that there are certain issues that you might not see or be drawn to talk about, like I might have talked about the election, but not Standing Rock, or Puerto Rico, but not detention centers in Texas. There's no perfect answer, but I'd love to hear how you manage that.
I can't say that I've ever managed that. I mean, you're making me think, what kind of errors have I made previously? But what my mind went to was Tina's think and share that you all did in the beginning, is to not necessarily frame the discussion, but to allow the community in the room to frame the discussion so all of those things can come up, because you're never going to tap into everything. So maybe that's a strategy to just kind of get people talking about the things that are on their minds. What's on your mind right now? What's on my mind might be different than what's on your mind, and just allowing the space for that. So maybe that's one strategy.
My name is Stephanie Siegel. I'm a professor in art practice. I was just curious about this idea of like triage response in the classroom. So say, when a very specific event happens, and so you know immediately that, you have to, hopefully, you address it, versus this idea of a kind of, I guess, constant attention to the potential of things happening. In other words, like, when the election happened, and immediately in my classes, the students wanted to talk about it. And all of a sudden, I had to just, jump in, as everyone else did, to take time and space for it. And then realizing that as we move forward now through the years, there are going to be more of these moments. And so instead of kind of creating, having to kind of react on these kind of very harsh levels, like I'm trying to figure out ways of implementing and instituting a kind of broader responsiveness, even, so even at lower levels constantly for both students and myself. And it's interesting trying to think about that, because when the triage happens, like we're all exhausted. Like the free speech week, the elections, everything. I mean, it was just, I realized how completely unprepared I was and everybody else in that. So I guess I'm just curious about, if this is, I don't want to have to even say this is the new normal, but like if we are to just kind of accept that some of these like really awful things are going to be happening, like what is, and I also understand that, yeah, take a break, kind of relax, but I personally want to not be as caught off guard with how it rattled my senses of reality.
Thank you for that. And if I may, I noticed our colleague in the business school. I'm sorry, I missed your name. Elida. If you're a clinical psychologist, I suspect you have some expertise. It's also a very intentional way of having us begin a conversation. I'm wondering if these two issues are related. I'd love to hear what you have to say.
So in my previous life, I did a lot of consultation in schools in the mission for a few years around trauma-informed practices, and folks often were coming to meetings with a lot on their mind, and everybody's got different needs, whether it's national or something that happened, in the playground or with a parent, or, and we couldn't possibly talk about all those things. So one of the things that I implemented, which then we institutionalized, was every meeting started with a 1-minute meditation or a 2-minute meditation. And the hesitation is always, we don't have enough time. We got so much on the agenda, right, but then the reality is, if we don't create a little bit of space to just kind of ground ourselves, then we don't get nearly through half the agenda, because everybody's operating on this level. And I think, so one planful way could be to just, if this is our new norm, and we anticipate this is our reality, one way to have control or have something planful could just be, maybe it's you talk to your neighbor for a minute and kind of show what's on your mind today, or maybe it's just have a minute to just kind of check yourself and where you're at and reflect on something, either gratitude or something challenging that's happening, that'll prepare you to be present for what you need to learn today.
But what about this issue of you hit, you say something really nice about Puerto Rico, but you miss the detention centers, and I think that relates to your question of like, there's so many different potential pitfalls, I guess is one way of characterizing how you're describing that. How do we think about that?
Oh no, go ahead. Oh, so I wanted to I think in my department, I think this happens frequently, right? Because there's so many of these intersectional kinds of challenges that people face. So just as a practical matter, I think it's much easier to do it in smaller classes, which is why I'm very challenged by large classes, by 100 or 200 students, because it just makes it that much more difficult to manage that kind of reactivity in classrooms. In smaller classes, one of the things I really am very intentional about doing is I always have I have a lot of my small classes are always the same. There's always a writing exercise. There's always a moment of reflection. There's always some sort of intentional time that's very quiet in the classroom. But I always make a very intentional point to acknowledge that this is not many of the issues, particularly in social welfare, they're not simply academic or intellectual exercises. They are the lived experience of many of the people who are in the classroom. So I always reemphasize that and always try to encourage students to share whether if it's appropriate in a public space to do so, but also to come and talk to me. And so then I tend to get to know the students, so I don't necessarily feel that I have to address every single social issue that's going on at the time, but to try to create a space in which students are seen. And so when all human beings feel seen, they don't necessarily have to, it doesn't have to be sort of the issue of the week, right? Because there's always something. But to create a larger context in which people feel if there is a particular issue that they are grappling with, that they can raise that either individually or in a class setting, and that bigger issue, that their issues might be taken seriously if, for example, we're talking a lot about Puerto Rico, but not the U.S. Virgin Islands, for example, right? So that's always a possibility.
Right. Tina, may I piggyback on that a little bit? I love that how you talked about the students being seen, and to me one of the most beautiful quotes I've heard, and I only learned of it recently, and I don't remember who said it, but it's the students don't care what you know until they know that you care. God, when I heard it, I was like, yeah, that's why, and so a little bit of an aside here is that I teach large classes, and I actively try to do small class things like learning people's names, which is it's devastating when I get students' names wrong on the basis of category membership. So I began this term by saying that and acknowledging that. So just again to your question of like what happens if you say something and not something, like I think there's something about the ability to that when the students are seen and when they see you, right? Amani, you were saying how you meet with students and they know you as Amani, not necessarily as Professor Nuru Jeter. Being present and acknowledging humanity, it's a way of allowing people to recognize that you're not going to have an answer for the problem of the week. And for being able to talk about the students, it also relates to my point about relationships. That we don't want to get exhausted, but I think it's absolutely critical that we develop an emotional connection with our students, and then you can begin to make mistakes or it not hold the person to a standard of perfection that I think we all know none of us can achieve.
I like the idea of resistance as a form of personal health as a form of activism. You know what I mean? That if public health issue is Black people experiencing poorer health and shorter lifetime, then it's a beautiful form of resistance to have health. That way we all get to talk about this in years.
Yeah,
Totally.
Absolutely.
Thank you. That was really enlightening. I love that.
Yeah.
Hi, Sean Burns. I direct Office of Undergraduate Research for the campus and teach on social movement history, ACEs and stuff like that. A couple observations about Berkeley at this moment. I think that, I'll use the analogy of when we go into teaching a new class, large or small, we try to set up a number of frameworks early in the class, certain readings, certain dialogue to create a framework so that all the difficult things that we address throughout that term can, be addressed by utilizing some of the terminology and tools that we explore early on, right? I mean, that's kind of class design 101. But for an institution at large, I think we're at a moment where we need to better figure out how we create certain kinds of frameworks and narratives that our students are exposed to early, and that all members of campus, faculty, staff, etc., are aware of and can utilize. So part of my thinking of this, when I recently went to the update on where Golden Bear orientation is going, right, this new way in which we orient our thousands of new students, and I heard, I was very involved in that, you know, but I didn't, and this is indicative of where I'm going with it, I didn't know about other parts of it. Like, for example, Rudy and Walker gave these talks that hundreds, if not thousands, of students were exposed to. Some students wrote, like, current students wrote this play that hundreds, if not thousands, of students were exposed to as part of that orientation, et cetera. So my thinking is that GBO creates a new framework because of its standardization, where we can set the framework for undergraduate student experiences here in a way that could be really powerful. But a key piece that's missing to me, and I think would be really generative, is that everyone could get exposure to some of these moments, let's say, you know, like, I'll return to like Rudy giving this talk. Let's say, I don't know, how large scale was the audience for that talk? Were you in Hospavilion when you gave that
That's a
talk?
question?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, we're talking, it was thousands of people. So if we all know the elements of that talk, and that's a kind of broadly available tool, you know, in some sense, that's culture building at a scale that we're not doing yet, you know? And the second observation I want to make is that I feel like, you know, as the imperative and initiative of equity and inclusion advances on the campus, that what we're going to witness, what we are witnessing, is the tension between that consciousness and that politics with other dimensions of the campus's tradition and structure and purpose and mechanisms that are totally antithetical to equity and inclusion. I mean, at the most basic level, like, we're grading everybody around us, you know, and the evaluation structure for everybody, staff, faculty, undergrads, is in tension with the kind of learning that foregrounds equity and inclusion, because we're just producing, like musical chairs, less and less seats the longer you go along. So that's going to be interesting, I'll just end by saying I'm excited about pushing against these other conventions and practices and traditions and mechanisms of operation, pushing against those from the perspective of equity and inclusion, and seeing what's going to shake out and be national, international leaders on this tip.
I think that Sean's comments are a great way to sort of some food for thought for us. Maybe it would be a good time in our last few minutes here to just talk amongst ourselves and us, maybe in pairs or in small groups, to try to think about some of the strengths and challenges that Sean just outlined, but in a broader sense. We're facing a lot here, I think, as a country, as a community, and as a particular campus that's had a particular kind of foothold in many kind of intellectual debates, right? And the tensions that arise as a result of those. So, if you wouldn't mind just sharing with each other, what do you think? What are the strengths and challenges we're facing as a Berkeley campus in the community, and how might we come together to address them?
And can I add one, and just in terms of food for thought, when you all get together, in addition to the comments that Sean made and the question that you're raising, Evelyn, raised the issue of resilience. And my understanding, and I'm not 100% certain about what's going on campus, but I've heard something about there being a movement on campus to try to cultivate resilience among the students on campus. So what I want to suggest, going back to like that model of toxic stress and chronic stress, is resilience actually a good thing? Right? Like, what does it mean to be resilient? And then going back to Tina's point about multi-level, right? Because that certainly puts the onus on the individual to be resilient to their environment. To what degree is the responsibility, and I don't want to say it's campus's responsibility, it's a shared responsibility, but so that we can all exist in an environment where we're not forced to have to be resilient. Why do we have to be resilient? I'm tired of sick and tired. I'm sick and tired of being sick and tired. I'm tired of, right? So just an extra nugget as you.
Okay, there is a difference between resilience and numbness. The thing here was being sick and tired, being sick and tired. Being resilient is not getting sick and tired. It's being able to continue with whatever needs to be done, but without numbing myself. So I don't know. It seems to me that there is a difference between being resilient, being numb, and being sick and tired forever.
Yeah, I mean, I can tell you, like in the work that I do, like, you know, this idea of being a superwoman, right? Like it's a coping mechanism, but at what cost? When we think about African American folklore tale of John Henry, he beat the steam engine, but he also dropped dead right after that. At what cost? At what toll? What is the cost of coping, right? So, I mean, I think there are multiple ways to think about resilience.
And one is building resilience and ignoring the bigger structural issue that needs to change.
Yeah, that's okay.
Yeah, and I just wanted to, just appreciate too, in the beginning of your talk, you honored that the work that you're committed to will extend beyond your lifetime. So there's this sense of remembering that the way that we adapt and shift is something that has come, been happening several times before. It's like I don't get a sense of this being new. What I do feel, I mean, just on this point of this idea of resilience, is there is an evolution of consciousness. Speaking of what you talked about earlier, so where as it emerges, the resilience is required in order to actually shift. So, Sean, you mentioned like the need for the cultural sharing, and to be in a position where the organizing is no longer isolated, but starts to connect and coalesce more. And I feel that, I mean, just what resonates with me is that this is the time, and we have to keep saying and affirming that, and honor it so that it can be, so that the environment does shift, rather than, remaining in like the retrospective reality. But I do not take lightly the idea of like constantly being locked into toxic environments, and the evidence of that, and the way in which it's been designed. But I also feel that there is the gift in recognizing that and having it laid out, is that's the opportunity to say, well, now we can actually shift the environment and remaining in that consciousness, and how do we normalize that as the way to be. And I feel like that's what the beauty of this kind of gathering. It gives us an opportunity to imagine together, because that's the higher sense that's required. Now we know we need a different environment. What does it actually look like? Are you going to show up when we say, come on, let's get together and be different? You know what I mean? Like, and I use the implication in my voice because that's really, what's required. It's stepping outside of what is supposed and assumed as normal, and shifting the energetics so that I can be fully present and what actually feels correct, rather than settle into the toxicity and be locked in it like something doesn't feel right. So I think that's the other layer of the arts being so important to shaping and molding the way that you transcend the realities that we can see that have manifested because of the historical baggage, but yet there's always been that sense of inspiration to get, to the other side. I don't want to lose sight of, the higher the next step, the higher sense that's required, imagination.
Yeah. Imagination and creativity, right? To think about what is possible for us, right? Yeah. Did you have a question?
Yeah, so what I'm here.
What's your name?
Gabby. I'm in integrative biology instruction. And so what I'm hearing is actually what she's saying too, but I was going to try to put a word to it because we were saying, do we really need resilience? And I think resilience is a step above just surviving and just getting through it. Being resilient is like getting all the tools in your toolbox of how do we cope with this and deal with this. But then the next step, exactly, I didn't catch your name in front. But what you're saying is going further than being just resilient, and the way that I understand that and the word that I put to it is thriving. And so taking all of this from our community and our tools that we're all learning, it's being more than resilient, but you still have to, you survive and then you're resilient and then you thrive. So it's kind of
We want to
moving on
thrive.
a path that keeps going. And hopefully keeps going as we all keep talking about it.
Can I?
It's a really exciting time.
If I may just, Taki, if I may, I just want to connect your comment to Dax's question about that lonely individual who doesn't know what to do. And you're mentioning and back to your point, Tina, about sort of that there's a stark difference between sort of the individual that's kind of locked in and then sort of a much that you're part of a much broader thing that includes the arts, that includes conversations and planfulness towards what to do. So thank you.
Absolutely. I see people are dispersing. I wanted to make just to thank everybody, to thank the panelists, and to thank the audience. I wanted to make an announcement before we all disperse, which is that the American Culture Center is putting on a really excellent presentation on February 7th. I have flyers here. The title of it is Whose Classroom? The Generative Potential of Conflict in Higher Education. And so it's going to be a facilitated conversation about using the misunderstandings and conflicts that come in the classroom, that are sort of inevitably arise in the classroom, to develop a sense of community and to sort of overcome some of these challenges. So here we've talked a lot, I think, about the building community. This is sort of saying that even conflict in the classroom can be generative in and of itself in some respects, right? So I'll pass these out in case you're interested.
Thank you, everybody.